So coming back to this, you see Darko Suvin adopted Bloch's idea of the novum in his theorization of science fiction. So just to emphasize, Bloch was not actually speaking about science fiction or even literature, speaking about philosophy and politics, but Suvin was a literary critic who basically takes up this idea of the new thing and the basic principles of it and uses it as a framework to understand science fiction and thereby develops what I would call the most influential theory of science fiction to date. Novum, as Suvin conceives it, a novelty, innovation, relationship, setting, something, anything really, right? It's pretty broad in its currency that assumes a dominant role in a science fiction text. Now, that's probably the key idea there. It's something that sort of seems to overarch or to kind of control the direction of the narrative. And we'll see that represented very pointedly when we get to, say, William Slater's The Duplicate, because you do have some literary works that just have a novum, and it's just a gadget, some piece of technology, something that seems to be an alien artifact or comes from the future, and it just controls the action, controls the direction of the narrative. What defines a novum is the feeling that it is something very new, futuristic, one could say. That's typically what the novum is. It's something that feels as though it came from the future. So not our present day context, but something that is awaiting us in the future, or perhaps an alien species as well. Usually we go on the assumption that an alien artifact that finds its way to Earth would represent a technology more advanced than ours. So in that sense, you could also say from the future too. Say there, the second point, a novum can be a new machine or a gadget that enters a familiar space. The land ironclads, Wells' story, which we're going to look at next time, The Duplicate, which I just mentioned, provide a couple of examples. So you can have a setting for a story or a novel that is just our setting. Contemporary context, case of The Duplicate, suburban America, everything just looks as you would expect it to be in this very familiar environment. And then there is this thing, this machine that crashes into that space. And it completely changes everything, throws everything off kilter because it's a sci-fi object or a futuristic object. Novum, by definition, does not belong in that space. It comes from an outside context. But the novum can be bigger than that. It doesn't necessarily just have to be a thing. It can rise to the level of an entire setting. We'll look at that when we take into account Asimov's Foundation. Also the film The Empire Strikes Back. You consider Star Wars. The entire universe of Star Wars is a novum in the sense that it is unfamiliar to us, feels very futuristic. The whole galaxy in which that world is set is on its own level a novum because the entire setting is new and unfamiliar to us. So there are many kind of variations in terms of how big, expansive the novum can be, but what defines it is that kind of futuristic feel to it. The novum opens the way to a new world, but this is not necessarily a fantasy world. Rather, the new world tends to be based on empirical science. Consequently, there is usually an aspect of a realism to the world. The novum typically provides the entry point into the science fiction world. And time permitting, we're going to look at a couple of film clips that give that sense. You have that sense when you're watching a movie or even reading a book for the first time. Wait for the novum to arise that signals to you you're reading a sci-fi book. Because usually something is there. You suddenly encounter something, some object, piece of technology, and it maybe appears right at the very beginning. Again, time permitting, we'll take a look at the opening sequence of A New Hope, Star Wars. Big, huge spaceship flies overhead, right? Pursued by another giant spaceship. They're firing lasers at one another. Sci-fi. There you go. This is not our world. Takes you immediately out of that space, but it can be delayed as well. It can take you, subtracting context, of course, if you're just watching the film, you don't really know. Take you a while until something like that crops up and suddenly hits you. It's sci-fi. That's what I'm watching right now. So the novum typically provides that moment of entry into this alternate world, futuristic world, alien world, something that's taking us outside of our familiar context. But that's a very important point. And Suvin, I think, was a little bit dogmatic about that. Subsequent critics have been more flexible, but he's emphatic it's not just a fantasy world. So it's not the same as a world where people fly around for no reason whatsoever. There's this notion that it should be based on science, that there should be that scientific groundwork. And so the kind of basis of it is that underneath it all, it is still the same universe. There are still the same fundamental forces operating. Gravity is a thing here. I mean, that's typically the case in most science fiction works. Or also, there's that aspect of realism to it, and this is often the case in sci-fi, where people behave the way that you would expect normal people to behave in everyday life. Say there that you could also even say there's that aspect of realism or naturalism embedded into science fiction. There's a very famous kind of realist, naturalist photograph of New York City, a downtrodden area in the late 19th century. Early literary naturalism incorporated scientific themes from the late 19th century, including Darwinian ideas. That's not to say the naturalists were sci-fi writers, but they did take into account the science of their era, which tended to be the late 19th century and tended to have notions of survival of the fittest, although that's not strictly linked conclusively to Darwin, but just Darwinian evolutionary themes. Naturalism often presents people as animals driven by base needs and desires. So naturalism picks up on that underlying theme that we are, underneath it all, these bestial creatures, these mammals, and that when we look at the reasons why we do things, when we look at our basic motives, we just see a lot of the same things that drive animals, these kinds of base needs and desires, whether it pertains to hunger or sexuality or violence, that it'd be nice to think that humans are motivated by really higher ideals or moralistic principles, but naturalists tend to say, well, no, it's just the same kind of bestial drives that we see in animals. Those are the kinds of things that are most important impetuses for people. Also portrays people battling against larger external forces, things that are bigger than them. And it could just be trends in society, or it could be natural forces, nature itself, that's very big in the naturalist tradition, or it could just be something like someone's fate or destiny. Naturalists are big on the idea of determinism, the notion that you cannot escape your fate, or you cannot escape the things that you're wired to do. And I would say that those aspects of naturalism, which are all part of displaying a very realist interpretation of how people behave, not romantic, right, not fantasy-based, but very realistic in terms of not sugar-coated, I would say those aspects you often find in science fiction. You often find those representations of people's basic motives or what it's like to struggle against these larger external forces. I mentioned Star Wars. Speaking of determinism and the idea of being kind of caught up in your fate or your destiny, I mean, how much free will do the people actually have in the Star Wars universe? They all seem to be fated to do particular things. They're all kind of set along these larger trajectories and destinies, and you often have the impression, or at least I do, watching the series, that people cannot escape what's going to happen to them, that they're just being funneled along towards this final end. New World thus tends to be a reflection of the familiar world up to a point, so not a completely fantastical world, not something totally divorced from our familiar reality, but familiar enough, creating a sense of estrangement and liminality. That's something that Subin was big on when he was theorizing science fiction. Estrangement, the feeling of seeing your own world in a new way and feeling a little bit estranged from it, feeling a little bit divorced from it, feeling as though the familiar has been made strange to you or made unusual. That's perhaps one of the effects of science fiction. It kind of rebounds or doubles back on our familiar society and makes us look at it in a new way, and the experience can be a little bit discomforting, uncomfortable perhaps, as we're forced to look at our familiar setting from this lens. Liminality basically means caught up in between different things, occupying two different realms simultaneously. Science fiction, the realm of the known and the unknown. Something familiar to us, such as empirical science, but also something unfamiliar to us, such as the novum. So that's the idea of liminality, something that is simultaneously known or unknown, familiar, strange, something that is simultaneously futuristic and yet nonetheless placed in the present. That idea of kind of being split or divorced or being pulled between these two different realms at the same time. So, film clip. I think we have time for this. This is actually 2001, which we're going to take a look at. Let's go back. Advertisement. Okay, so beginning of the film.
Mæja málari lenti í slysi. Fortis fylgdi henni.
Saw advertisements. first 3.5 minutes of the film, and I think you can see there, kind of an introduction of a novum there. If you were just watching the first, 2.5 minutes of the film, and you had no context at all, you didn't know what movie you're watching, you thought, does it go on like this for 2 hours with these primates running around, screeching at each other? I guess this is a wildlife type of movie. And you see the introduction of this new object, and immediately, oh, it's a sci-fi film. That's right, because you have this new thing, this novum, which suddenly appears at that particular moment. Just as a question, what is the novum, too? You've seen 2001, or just watching the first 3.5 minutes, what is it, do you think? Yeah, that's the way it's portrayed in the film. They touch this thing, monolith, as it's been called, and it seems to impart some kind of knowledge or wisdom to them. What ideas? What is it, actually, exactly?
Is it the spark that eventually leads to the dawn of man?
Yeah, that's the way it's portrayed in the film, right? Something that kind of triggers some revolution in their thinking, their thought processes. You see at the beginning, they're clearly meant to be depicted just as animals. They're kind of screaming, screeching at one another. One of them gets felled by, a leopard that jumps on him, right? So kind of sense of the primates just being caught up in the ecosystem, right? The victim of natural forces. Any other thoughts about it? What is the novum exactly there? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like a piece of technology. I think it's widely seen as an alien artifact. You have to watch the entire film to kind of get that a sense of it. I would say, in addition to that, it looks like something we would build. Because you look at the structure of it with the kind of straight edges and lines, very symmetrical. Like this object. You think nature doesn't produce things that look like that, at least normally not. You look at the kind of formless, craggy landscape in the background. Nature is much more haphazard and chaotic in terms of the things it produces, whereas that looks like this artifact or a monument or something like that, something that we would create. So it's almost as though human consciousness kind of visits these primates. And it is, I would say in that sense, a vision of the future arriving in the past. So something futuristic, some piece of future technology, which clearly doesn't belong in this environment, but nonetheless seems to trigger the primates' cognitive revolution. And also, the monolith is set up as this object that, to a degree, dominates the rest of the film, recurs throughout the course of the film. So I think that's a good representation of a novum. Appears relatively early in the film, but not immediately. Takes a couple of minutes for it to appear, but certainly changes the direction of the movie. So before that, typically science fiction looks to maintain some of those links to realism, science, facts, etc. Not always, but that is often the idea. We might ask the question, well, why does it float off into the realm of the purely fantastic or the purely imaginary? I think there are a lot of ways to address those questions, but here are just a couple of provisional answers. Well, first, because it is science fiction. That's how it sets itself up. So there is, I think, often this idea of the literature and the genre grounding itself on science. Now, it doesn't have to be an exact recreation of science, but usually appealing to science and keeping it at the level of plausibility or possibility, if nothing else. Second point there, a science fiction world is often already fantastic enough. So in other words, when you enter the sci-fi realm, here an image, I think that's from Berkey, John Berkey, who was an American painter who designed the Star Wars posters and did a lot of sci-fi influenced art. When you look at these kinds of images, it already looks really fantastic. It already looks really outlandish, like it's pulling you into a completely different environment or context. That element of realism or naturalism in science fiction is almost this way of kind of pulling us back into the world we're familiar with keeping us grounded in a kind of commonsensical or realistic space. And also preserving the connection between the present and the future. The idea that science fiction often looks to show that these visions or these ideas could in fact come true in the future. That it's not something that is completely implausible or fantastical, but rather it is indeed a possibility, something we could reach in the future. Though, of course, there's a lot of slippage there with different kind of elements which belong in the world of fantasy, like shape-shifting, for instance. That can show up in science fiction works and other things too. Other subjects and themes in science fiction, and here again, we're just looking at a couple of examples. There are a lot more that we could bring up, but I think these are the ones that are going to be relevant to the class, so worth taking into account here. Deviancy and the tendency to filter familiar cultural narratives through science, the sublime, the grotesque, and politics and anxiety. Say, fiction can assemble scientific ideas into a narrative that can be informative. In fact, there's a certain branch of science fiction, typically known as hard science fiction, that tries to do exactly that. That hard science fiction often tries to really stay in the bounds of empirical science, to create representations or depictions that are quite realistic in the scientific sense. Not things that actually do exist today, but things that certainly could exist at some point in the future if our technology continues to advance. And also, various scientific narratives can be informative about a range of different subjects. Some works, for instance, will deal with cosmology, deal with biology, deal with quantum physics. You could learn about those subjects through reading these fictional texts. And yet typically we tend to expect some playful deviance in a work of fiction. We're not necessarily reading a narrative in order to become informed about science. We're rather reading to be entertained and to be sort of taken into a different world. So I think for the most part, most science fiction, with some exceptions, tends to kind of bend science a bit. It's not going to be completely faithful to what is totally realistic, but is going to branch out a little bit from that, press against the slightly improbable or the implausible. I would say that's true of most science fiction. Alternatively, fiction often takes a cultural narrative or myth and filters it through science. Now, this is the kind of inversion. We have the idea that science can influence a narrative. Someone can read a scientific idea, scientific theory, and that can inspire the story that they write. But it's often the other way around. And that's why I would say a lot of science fiction deals with quite familiar narratives or myths. Again, to return to the example we're using so far, Star Wars, which I mentioned last time, deals with very kind of far-reaching universal myths about the struggle between good and evil. You have warlords and princesses and some poor farm boy who wants to get off this rock of a planet. All of those things. It's basically just taking a narrative which has existed since ancient times, since classical civilization, taking a very familiar narrative and filtering it through science. I mean, that's essentially what the Star Wars franchise does. That's what a lot of science fiction does. And I think there's a tendency we have to latch onto those narratives because they are familiar to us. They do have that kind of a sense of grounding for us, and so we relate to them, identify with them quite readily. The sublime, that element of the sublime, this is another subject that shows up in a lot of science fiction works. The sublime typically refers to something that is vast, boundless, and awe-inspiring. And there have been different theories about the sublime. It's often associated with nature, and the sublime can make us feel our smallness and relative insignificance. Now, you think in terms of the natural world, where there are a lot of things we can see in nature. Mountains come immediately to mind. You go out, venture out, and look at some very vast, tall, grandiose mountains, and they might be awe-inspiring, but they might also make us feel our relative smallness. The natural world looks very imposing, looks very spectacular, and we're aware of our kind of slightness compared to the natural world, and ideas of the sublime have been around, well, we can trace that back to classical times, but they were especially big during the period of Romanticism. Romanticist poets like to go out into nature and get that feeling of being inspired by the sheer grandiosity and the size and the greatness of the natural world. I say there, space might qualify as the ultimate realm of the sublime. I mean, if you want something that's kind of vast and boundless and awe-inspiring, something that can really make us feel how minute we really are, well, we only need to look out into outer space, look at the cosmos, look at stars, galaxies, the sheer size and scope of a space with its billions of light years. I mean, those things are really awe-inspiring, but those things also make us feel what kind of small, minute little creatures we really are. But the sublime can also emerge through the technology that we create. And that's part of, I would say, the tension, the push and pull in science fiction. On the one hand, you have this vast outer realm that's so much bigger than we are, and so much kind of a longer lasting than we are as well. Everything out there in the cosmos has been around before we got here, still be around after we're gone. And yet the technology that we create, the things that we build, that can be a kind of conduit towards the sublime, and I don't think we'll have time to look at them today, but nonetheless, take a look at the opening clips from A New Hope, as well as from Blade Runner. The other clip as well, where you see this vast cityscape and this giant pyramid-like building rising up out of the ground with these huge lights and all these layers, and that is just a human invention. Something synthetic, artificial that we've created, and yet it's made to look like a mountain or something giant and imposing, something awe-inspiring that we have created on our own. The possibilities of technology to kind of reach the level, or not reach the level, but to try to duplicate, and in an imperfect way, the cosmic realm, to try and capture that sense of grandiosity. That's something in science fiction. So giant spaceships, giant battle stations, huge things, apparatuses, technology, all those things. The empire that's constructed in Asimov's Foundation. Think about that in relation to this idea of the sublime. The other side of the sublime is the grotesque, another subject that comes up in a lot of science fiction. The grotesque having to do with things like monstrous creations or diabolical alien creatures, creatures that often are literally grotesque. They look disgusting and repulsive to us. I mean, the Alien franchise captures that as well as any kind of sci-fi narrative. Science fiction, the grotesque often involves the violation of otherwise rigid categories, especially those that rest on physical or biological classification. The grotesque often deals with this idea of breaking down boundaries or breaking down the neat divisions that we're accustomed to seeing in place, especially when it comes precisely to the sciences. Look at the Alien franchise and you can maybe appreciate the eradication of a typical binary, or I should say a boundary that exists, the difference between us and insects. I think what the Alien franchise basically does is it blows up insects into giant dimensions, because that's what the alien creatures essentially are. They're these like giant bugs, giant kind of spider-like or cockroach beings, and they have a queen. There's the queen alien right there. And they have a nest, a hive, and they use humans as incubators. And I think that's basically what the franchise does. It just asks the question of what would it be like if humans were coming up against, fighting against these overgrown mammoth insects. Well, we're accustomed to insects, to bugs, keeping their place, right, as these small, tiny beings that we can just squash if we want to. So that's the breakdown of a kind of biological classification. No, insects over there, tiny, small, humans over here, much larger. What happens if you just kind of warp or inflate insects to this much larger level? Yeah, question?
Aren't they also
The aliens as viruses? Yeah, potentially. I think that's valid as well. The idea that the aliens are these kinds of viral creatures. I mean, another thing that's kind of relevant to the present day, right? In the kind of COVID era. There are questions, ideas? I should ask you if you have questions as we go.
Not a question, but I wanted to add to a comment that another example where aliens are seen actually as viruses could be extant.
Extant?
Yeah, it's a series. There's Ali Berry, she goes to space, gets infected, comes back, makes it away.
Okay, great. Yeah, good to know. So, yeah, it is a thing. Maybe genre, well, again, in this era, we could easily see how that could be a sort of a genre unto itself. Finally, I want to talk about politics and anxiety, too. This is something that it brings in a little bit more of the historical 20th century dimension to science fiction, but I think it's worth considering, especially in the American context. There is also a reason we could say why science fiction came to such prominence in the 20th century, especially in the late 20th century, because it really overlapped with certain anxieties in American culture and American politics. This became the era of the so-called space race. I'll talk about that in a moment, with the Soviet Union, which was a part of the Cold War, period of tension and struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the 20th century also was the era where you see the development of this big kind of technocratic apparatus in America. The use of modern technology and space-age technology to an extent to build up this nation-state, this militarized nation-state, and to basically create this larger infrastructure, and also to kind of gain control of technology. And I would say that when you look at America, most of the works, not all of them, but most of the works we're looking at are American science fiction. You can classify them as that. When you look at the case of America, I think the idea of the control over technology and the control over science, long-standing, deeply ingrained anxiety within that culture. You can trace it all the way back to the 19th century. There you see a famous painting, American Progress, representing the ideal of manifest destiny. That was a period in the 19th century when a whole group of American settlers, colonials of European descent, settled the West. That would be the western part of America, basically occupying lands that were already inhabited by Aboriginals, striking out into what they regarded as the frontier, the untamed wilderness, setting up shop there, establishing living quarters there, and basically expanding the boundaries of the American nation-state ever further westward. And this became a much idealized period in American history and culture. Still is to an extent, especially in kind of MAGA land or Donald Trump's version of America, this kind of idealization of the frontiers people or the pioneers, the settlers from the late 19th century. Now, it's widely acknowledged today, though, that infrastructure, technology, really played the determinant role here in, quote, settling the West. It was the expansion of the railroad, for instance, onto the western frontiers. That was what part of what enabled the movement of pioneers and settlers. It was also the expansion of the vast American corporate industry, which was in its infancy in the 19th century, but really starting to take hold in stronger terms. And also the growth of an American military as well. That kind of infrastructure, the technology, that's what allowed for the American nation state to expand. So this kind of idealization of individual people, individual settlers striking out onto the western frontier, making a new life for themselves, well, it is to a degree just an idealization of what was really a process fueled by modern technology and modern industry. And I think that's really fitting because you see with America that close relationship between a sense of American national identity or something that makes the American people special, or these chosen people who have the right just to take over all this land. That kind of a sense of American identity, but wedded to technology, wedded to science, wedded to infrastructure. Now, moving ahead to the 20th century, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first synthetic satellite. The launch of Sputnik is widely regarded as the first salvo in the so-called space race that developed between the Soviet Union and the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. And this threw the American government and the American media into panic mode, because this was the Soviet Union, their rival in the Cold War, not necessarily enemy because they were not at war with one another, but nonetheless a sworn rival, seeming to get an advantage when it came to the development of modern technology. And not only that, but gaining some kind of foothold in outer space, because this was the first satellite launched up into orbit around the Earth. And so there was this immediate response for America that they have to combat this. They have to make up the ground that they've lost, and they did so by starting the Apollo missions, which culminated with the moon landings in the late 1960s. And that's part of the reason why the moon landings are these kind of lionized moments in American history, because that was supposed to be America's big response and its big triumph to Sputnik, landing individual astronauts on the moon. I mentioned this before, there's no real pragmatic reason to go to the moon, unfortunately. I mean, I guess it's there, so you might as well try to land on it, but there's nothing further you can do with it, because it's just this big dusty rock. And that's the main reason why the Apollo missions just kind of peaked and then faded out, because it was almost just a kind of, well, yes, in order to actually branch outward and to explore, but a kind of national pride thing as well. And this is ongoing today, and it continues to deal with technology, infrastructure, but the orientation towards space is kind of pervasive as well. There you see the seal of the United States Space Force, which was launched in 2019. I think Trump took full credit for creating the Space Force, although I'm not sure what exactly he did about it, but nonetheless, he just had some big celebration, personal celebration when it happened. I think this is the first Space Force that exists among any country. It's a branch of the Air Force, so not completely independent. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to do either, but this is the idea of the militarization of space, but keeping that advantage going. Keeping that advantage going on the level of science and technology, and ensuring that we have some kind of control over the outer reaches, making sure that if there are going to be any kinds of missiles or bombs that come raining down from above, that we're going to be the ones who decide where they fall. I mean, that's basically the idea there. And so I think this kind of idea of trying to maintain some kind of control over space, however limited it might be, I'm sure it's going to continue on into the future. The irony is that many people, many cosmologists, as well as astronauts, have reported that their study of space makes them aware of just how petty and horrible and pointless a lot of these political grievances are. I mean, many astronauts who have been in outer space reported that when they look through their windows down on the Earth, makes them realize the unbelievable pettiness of human grievance next to the kind of size and scope, not to mention the grandeur of the world. You could probably have that experience yourself if you just go out when you can during the winter, look at the starlight, the night sky, and it might make you aware of the vastness above and also the incredible smallness of human activity down here on the planet. So that's the introduction, historical and theoretical foundations of science fiction. So, as I say, next time we'll be getting into the literary readings, so do read, I'd say read both of the works, H.G. Wells's Land Ironclads as well as Burning Chrome, by Gibson, two completely different works, and we'll come back for our discussion sessions next time, so enjoy the rest of the week.
For the first session or one for one session and then...
We're doing both next week. The first on Monday,